The house that wouldn't blink. The first time anyone heard the walls breathe was during a windless night in the fall of 1951. The house had only stood for 3 months then, its bricks still pale from the kiln and its windows so clean, they looked like they hadn't yet decided whether to reflect the world or keep it out entirely. Colorado Springs lay spread below like a quilt sewn from porch lights. But here on Hidden Valley Road, the darkness held dominion. The street lamps hadn't been installed yet. The sidewalk stopped halfway down the block, ending in raw earth. From the road, the house's square silhouette looked almost shy, the kind of place you wouldn't notice unless you were already trying to forget it. Inside, the Galvins slept, or at least most of them did. Donald Galvin Sr. had brought the war home in his marrow, though he would never admit it, not even to himself. He had sailed back from the Pacific with a chest full of medals and a head full of broken film reels, images that spliced themselves into his waking life like jump cuts, flashes of fire, the pop of bone, a sudden snap of silence where a friend had been. He never spoke of it, but it leaked through him in quieter ways. He paced rooms at night like a ghost rehearsing its route. He would sit at the dinner table long after the meal had ended, staring at his hands as if they were evidence. Sometimes Mimi would find him standing in the yard, barefoot, shirtless, as though he had been trying to peel off the century. Mimi was the opposite, a fortress of starch and control. She wore discipline the way other women wore perfume. Even her grief had posture. She'd once dreamt of New York, of galleries and midnight jazz and books that smelled like the sea. But she'd traded that for a family, and then for order. Each morning she scrubbed the house until it gleamed like an alibi. She folded napkins so sharp they could cut, pressed her children's hair into straight lines, and prayed with a mechanical intensity that made the rosary beads click like tiny bones. The children, at first only 3, soon 12, were raised like soldiers in a private campaign for perfection. Breakfast was punctual. Voices were measured. Shoes shone like mirrors. The house did not tolerate chaos. Not visibly, but chaos was clever. It learned to hide. The first to sense it was Don Jr., the golden boy. At 9, he had the posture of an adult and eyes that seemed to squint at something invisible just behind everyone's shoulder. He excelled at school, at sports, at pretending he didn't feel like he was dissolving. At night, while the others slept, he would lie awake and listen. At first he thought it was the old pipes sighing, or the wind twisting through the vents. But on nights when the air outside was utterly still, the sound came again, soft and rhythmic like lungs dragging breath through stone. The walls, he thought, were breathing, he told no one. Instead, he began cataloging it the way his father cataloged the war, silently, obsessively, as if naming it might make it more real. He marked the nights on a secret calendar under his mattress. By winter, every square was filled. He wasn't alone for long. James, 2 years younger, started waking up with nosebleeds. He'd shuffle into the kitchen at dawn, face pale and lips stained dark, muttering that the house had been humming again. Mimi dismissed it as growing pains, though she said it with a strange briskness as if the words were meant less for him than for the air listening in. That was her way with all unpleasant truths, seal them in language, then bury them under chores. But James's hum grew louder. Sometimes it vibrated the silverware. Sometimes it whispered his name from the hallway while everyone else was in bed. Once, while kneeling to tie his shoe, he jerked upright so fast he split his scalp on the edge of the table, screaming that something had touched the back of his neck. The spot he pointed to was cold, clammy, like a stone left in the dark. By spring, none of them could ignore it. It started small. A photograph shifted on the wall, though no one had passed. A glass slid an inch across the counter. Drawers stood open in the morning that had been locked the night before. Donald Sr. accused the boys of mischief, lined them up military style, and demanded confessions. No one spoke. They only stared at the floor, ashamed and bewildered, as though they had failed a test whose questions they'd never been given. The incidents escalated. At night, they'd hear doors unlatching by themselves. Soft thuds like someone pacing barefoot through the hall. The smell of ozone, sharp and electric, lingering in the stairwell. Once, Don Jr. found every clock in the house stopped at exactly 3:17 a.m., their hands quivering like trapped insects. He tried to restart them. They all broke at once. It was Mimi who finally snapped. One Sunday after Mass, she locked every door, drew every curtain, and marched through the house with holy water in one hand and a carving knife in the other, muttering scripture like a threat. She left crucifixes above every threshold. She polished them until her fingers bled. For 3 days, the house went still. Then, on the 4th, the baby monitor crackled to life. Mary was only a few months old, the youngest, the fragile jewel of Mimi's empire. That night, everyone was asleep except Don Jr., who was reading under the covers with a flashlight. The monitor on the nightstand beside his bed hissed with static. He frowned, leaned closer. Through the static came a voice, not crying, not cooing, speaking. A man's voice, low and deliberate, reciting something that sounded like numbers but slid and twisted into words. The cadence was mechanical, like a machine trying to imitate human rhythm. Then silence. Then the sound of breathing, slow, wet, too close to the microphone. Don Jr. ran to the nursery. The crib was empty, and the window was open. The missing hour. The search began in silence. When Don Jr. screamed that the crib was empty, the entire house seemed to hold its breath. Doors flew open. Bare feet slapped against hardwood floors. Mimi arrived first, her nightgown snapping behind her like a cape. Donald Sr. just steps behind. His jaw clenched so hard the muscles jumped. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. The absence spoke for him. The window above the crib was open no more than 6 inches, but that was enough to let in the night air, sharp and metallic with the smell of wet earth. It was also enough to let something in or out. The curtains stirred like someone had just passed through. The search within minutes. Every Galvin child was awake, and every light in the house blazing. Donald Sr. barked orders like a field commander, dividing them into pairs to search the house and yard. They moved in frantic circuits, checking closets, crawl spaces, underbeds, as though Mary could have simply uncrawled herself into some unlikely hiding place. Outside, the grass was beaded with frost and moonlight. No footprints. No sign of forced entry. Only the steady creak of the windmill down the road and the sound of their own breathing. It was as though the baby had evaporated. Mimi clutched the baby blanket they'd found on the nursery floor, her knuckles white around the fabric. Her lips moved soundlessly, a prayer or a threat, it was hard to tell which. When Donald suggested calling the police, she shook her head sharply. No. Her voice was flat, final. No police, she repeated. Not yet. It was not maternal instinct, but something colder, something trained. A military wife's reflex. Control the narrative, secure the perimeter, keep the outside world outside. The hour that disappeared when Mary was finally found, it was as though time had rewound itself. The clock on the mantel read 4:17 a.m. The house had gone quiet. Too quiet when a sound floated from the basement, a thin, papery wail. Donald Sr. and Don Jr. were the first down the steps, their shadows stretching against the wall like bars. Mary was lying in the center of the concrete floor, her face slack but unharmed. She wasn't crying anymore. She was smiling. Around her, drawn in some substance that glistened in the light like oil, was a ring. It wasn't random. It was a perfect circle. When Mimi saw it, she crossed herself and snatched the child up without stepping over the ring. Donald Sr. knelt and touched it with the tip of one finger. It was warm, and when he stood again, there was a look in his eyes that Don Jr. had never seen before, a look that said something is here with us. Aftermath from that night on. The house changed. Mimi had the windows nailed shut. Crucifixes were hung over every bed. The boys were forbidden to speak of the event outside the family, under threat of consequences. But children have long memories, and they are terrible at forgetting. Don Jr. and James whispered about it under blankets at night, about the voice on the monitor, about the strange warmth of the circle. It was James who first suggested that Mary hadn't been alone during that missing hour, that she had been with someone, or something. He added in a whisper. And Don Jr. did not laugh, because he had heard the breathing too. Escalation, the house grew restless. Objects moved at night, cutlery scattered across the kitchen table, chairs stacked neatly on top of one another. Sometimes the radio turned on by itself, but never to music. Only to static or sometimes a faint murmur of what sounded like conversation in another language. A language no one in the house spoke. And Mary began to change. At first it was small things. Her eyes would track movements no one else could see. She laughed at empty corners. When she began to talk, her first words were not mama or dada, but numbers, always the same sequence. repeated again and again until Mimi slapped her hand over the child's mouth and hissed, "Stop!" But she didn't stop. By the time she was 3, Mary would wake up screaming in the night, describing the man under the house. She said he whispered to her through the floorboards, told her things about the family, things she couldn't possibly know. She told James once that their father had killed a man during the war, not in combat but in anger. When Donald Sr. heard this, he hit the table so hard the salt shaker jumped. "She doesn't know what she's saying," he growled. But Mimi's face had gone pale, because she suspected Mary did know. Cracks in the regiment, the Galvin house was no longer a house. It was a pressure chamber. Donald Sr.'s temper, once merely cold, began to fracture. He was seen in the yard at night, shoveling at nothing, burying nothing. Mimi doubled down on ritual, turning dinners into silent vigils and Mass into mandatory penance. And the boys, Don Jr., James, Brian, grew stranger by the month. They fought more often, harder. Bruises bloomed across arms and jaws. The house echoed with sudden crashes, then silence as though whatever passed between them could not be named. But the worst came one night when Don Jr. was 13. He woke to find Mary standing beside his bed. She was holding something in her hand. It was the family's kitchen, shears, and they were wet. The man beneath the house Don Jr. would never forget, the way the blades gleamed in the dark. They caught the faint orange glow from the street lamp outside and turned it to a cold flicker, like lightning behind glass. Mary's hand was steady, too steady for a child of 3. Her nightgown was soaked at the hem and clung to her knees, dripping onto the carpet in slow, syrupy patters. "Mary," he whispered, voice hoarse with sleep. She didn't blink. "I had to cut him out," she said softly, as though repeating a line she had been taught. Then she smiled, a slow, uncanny pull of her lips that did not reach her eyes, and let the shears fall. They struck the carpet with a soft thud and left a single bead of water or blood on the blade. The crawl space the trail led under the house. They found it the next morning when Mimi, rigid and silent, stripped the bed to burn the sheets, and Don Jr. noticed the smell. Not rot, not blood, but something damp and mineral, like earth exhaled after a long burial. He followed it to the crawlspace hatch in the hallway floor. The hatch was ajar. It shouldn't have been. When Donald Sr. pried it open, the smell rose in a warm draft that made everyone take a step back. Dust sifted down from the beams like old breath. Mary pointed. "He's down there," she said matter-of-factly. Donald Sr. went first, flashlight in hand, jaw set. The beam sliced through the dark and struck something hanging from the underside of the floorboards. Strips of cloth, dozens of them tied like prayer flags, fluttering though there was no wind. Each strip was cut from their clothing, Mimi's aprons, the boys' old school uniforms, even a piece of Mary's infant blanket. And on each, scrawled in something brown and flaking, were numbers, rows and rows of numbers. Some were dates. Some were coordinates. Some didn't seem to follow any pattern at all. But everyone ended in the same 3 digits, 317. The change in Mary after that morning. Mary stopped speaking in full sentences. Instead, she whispered to the walls. She'd sit in corners for hours, lips moving, smiling faintly at nothing. Sometimes she hummed, a low, bone-deep sound that made dishes tremble in the cupboards. At night, her brothers would hear her footsteps pacing the hall. Sometimes they saw her standing at the end of the corridor, facing the wall, whispering into it like it had an ear. Once, when James tried to shake her out of one of her trances, she turned her head so fast it cracked and hissed, "Don't wake him!" "Who?" he asked, terrified. Mary's eyes were completely black in the moonlight. "The man," she said, "under the house." Fractures by the summer of 1957. The family was splintering. Donald Sr. had stopped speaking at the dinner table entirely, chewing with mechanical precision and staring at some point just beyond the far wall. When spoken to, he would flinch like someone had touched a live wire. He spent most nights digging in the yard by the flicker of a kerosene lamp, then smoothing the soil flat as if to erase his own footprints. Mimi had developed a tremor in her hands but refused to see a doctor. Instead, she cleaned until her skin split, scrubbing the house as though trying to remove something invisible soaked into the walls. She sang hymns under her breath while she worked, but always off-key as though she couldn't quite remember the melody. The boys grew feral, James developed a habit of staring at mirrors for hours. Brian stopped blinking for unsettling stretches of time. They fought constantly, knuckles bloodied, lips split, but never made a sound while doing it. Their silence was worse than screams, and through it all, Mary watched, smiling, waiting. The circle returns one night in October. During a rare moment of uneasy calm, Don Jr. woke to a sound he hadn't heard in years. The baby monitor, long since unplugged, crackling to life. A voice rose from it, not words this time, just a guttural groan like stone dragged across stone. Then Mary's door creaked open. She walked past his room without looking at him, eyes glassy, carrying a box of matches. He followed her down to the basement. She sat in the center of the concrete floor, exactly where they had found her years ago, and began striking the matches one by one, letting them burn down to her fingers without flinching. Around her feet something had appeared, the circle etched again into the floor in that same oily substance. This time it was moving, not spinning, not shifting, but breathing. Expanding and contracting in a slow, wet rhythm like the diaphragm of a living thing. "Mary," Don Jr. whispered. She looked up at him, and in her voice, perfectly clear and perfectly wrong, came the voice of a grown man. "She's not your mother." Then every match went out at once. The first vanishing. 2 days later, Brian disappeared. He had gone out to the shed to fetch a rake and never returned. The door was found standing open. Inside, the air was thick and still, as though the space had been sealed for years. The rake lay on the floor, its handle snapped in two. On the wall above it, scratched into the wood deep enough to splinter, were the numbers again, 3 and 17. Donald Sr. searched the property for 12 hours straight. He never spoke. Mimi didn't cry. She just closed the shed door, turned the lock, and whispered, "No one goes in there again." But that night, every clock in the house stopped at 3:17 a.m., and somewhere beneath the floorboards, something laughed. The hollowing. The first thing to vanish after Brian was trust. The second was sound. For 3 full days after his disappearance, the Galvin house fell silent, as though holding its own breath. Even the floorboards stopped their usual groaning, the old pipes ceased their sighs. The silence was thick, padded, unnatural, like the house had been wrapped in wool. No one spoke. Not because they had nothing to say, but because every word felt like it might draw something closer. Mimi floated through the halls like a sleepwalker, moving her lips in noiseless prayer. Donald Sr. locked himself in the garage, dismantling the lawnmower piece by piece and laying the parts out on a tarp in meticulous rows, only to rebuild it and start again. The children orbited each other like wary animals, eyes down, backs to walls, always leaving space, like prey learning to live with a predator they couldn't see. And Mary thrived. The game of names, it started subtly. She began calling her brothers by the wrong names, but not random ones. She called James 3. Don Jr. became 4. Richard was 6. Mark was 7. Each time they corrected her, she would tilt her head and smile faintly, as if amused they didn't understand the rules. Then one night at dinner, she whispered, "One is gone. The others are deciding." The room froze. Mimi gripped her rosary until the beads cracked like knuckles. Donald Sr. rose so fast his chair toppled and hissed, "Stop this." But Mary only stared at him with that eerie, bottomless calm and said, "You're 0. And somehow, that frightened him more than anything. The return of sound on the 4th night. The silence broke like a bone. It happened just after 3:17 a.m. Don Jr. woke to a shriek so sharp it seemed to come from inside his skull. It lasted exactly 1 second, cut off mid-breath, and then the house went still again. He ran to the hall. The others were already there, wide-eyed and shivering. The sound had come from the locked shed, the one where Brian had vanished. The shed Donald Sr. broke the lock with an axe. The door creaked open, revealing blackness so thick their flashlight seemed to bend away from it. The air was damp and hot like an exhalation from underground. Inside, the rake lay exactly as they'd left it, but the walls were wrong. They were slick, black, pulsing faintly, as though something inside them was slowly shifting its weight, and the numbers had multiplied. Where there had once been a single 317, the walls were now covered in rows upon rows of them, scratched deep into the wood as if by fingernails, each line perfectly spaced like tally marks. At the center of the shed sat Brian's shoes. They were upright, laces tied, empty. Donald Sr. stepped forward to pick them up, and the shed door slammed shut behind him with a force that rattled the hinges. The flashlights all went out at once. The darkness pressed against their skin like water, and from somewhere beneath their feet came the sound of knocking, slow, deliberate, like someone asking to be let in. When the door finally creaked open again, Donald Sr. stumbled out, clutching the shoes to his chest like relics. His eyes were blank. His lips moved silently. He would not speak again for 6 days. The cracks widened. Something inside the family ruptured that night. James accused Don Jr. of luring Brian out there. Don Jr. snarled back that maybe James had done it, that he had always been listening to the walls. They lunged at each other, fists flying, and only stopped when Mary clapped her hands once. Just once. The sound cracked like thunder. They both froze mid-swing, arms locked in the air. For 3 full seconds they couldn't move. Their muscles trembled, but their bodies wouldn't obey. Then Mary smiled and said, "He's deciding who stays," and their arms dropped limp to their sides. After that, none of them would be in a room alone with her. Mimi's revelation late one night. As the house hummed with that low animal thrum they were all pretending not to hear. Mimi took Don Jr. aside. Her voice was brittle, frayed. "Your father, he wasn't like this before the war," she whispered. "When he came back, he started building things in his sleep. He'd wake up in the crawlspace with nails in his hands. He said he was making a frame." "A frame for what?" Don Jr. asked. Her eyes flicked toward the floor. "For him," she said. "For the man beneath the house." And before he could ask anything else, she pressed her fingers to her lips and shook her head violently, as if the house might be listening. "The voice returns." That same night, the voice came back. It rose from the baby monitor in Mary's room, though she hadn't used it in years. Static hissed, then cleared, and a deep, calm male voice spoke. "0 is hollow. 1 is gone. The rest must choose." Every clock in the house stopped at 3:17, and then from under the floorboards came a second voice. Mary's, speaking in perfect unison with her own sleeping body upstairs. "I choose." The erasures started with photographs. Mimi kept dozens tucked in albums on the living room shelf. Snapshots of birthdays, baptisms, soccer trophies, all the evidence she had painstakingly curated to prove they were normal. But one morning, she found an empty page, just one, where Brian's 3rd birthday had been. Cake, candles, frosting on his nose. There was only the faint rectangular shadow where the photo had once been glued. The caption remained in her elegant cursive. "Brian turns 3, our bright boy." But the picture was gone, as if it had never existed. The vanishing within over the next week. More gaps appeared. In some photos, Brian blurred at the edges, dissolving like smoke. In others, he was simply missing, leaving only the negative space of where he had been standing. His name began disappearing from the margins of old-school reports, the ink lifting off the page in curled flakes. By the weekend, his bedroom was empty, not just of him, of anything that had ever suggested he lived there. The bed frame was gone. The wallpaper peeled away to reveal bare wood. The air smelled like untouched lumber, raw and dry, as though the room had only just been built. And worst of all, some of the siblings couldn't remember him at all. "Who's Brian?" Richard asked over breakfast, genuinely puzzled. Mimi screamed. The scream cracked in her throat and came out silent, like a film reel with the audio stripped away. The house rearranges as Brian's memory unraveled. The house began to change its shape. Doors appeared where none had been, leading into narrow hallways that bent at impossible angles before rejoining the main corridors. Windows shifted locations overnight. The kitchen pantry now opened into a long, dark stairwell that spiraled down farther than the basement should reach. The family tried to map it. They failed. No matter how carefully they counted steps, the distances changed between trips, and always, at the center of whatever new passage they found, they would see it, the circle, drawn on the floor, breathing, the splintering of time. The clocks began lying. Sometimes they would all jump forward by hours at once, the hands spinning like compass needles in a magnetic storm. Other times they froze for stretches that felt like whole afternoons, only to lurch back into motion with a sound like teeth snapping shut. Mimi caught Don Jr. standing in the hallway one evening, staring at the grandfather clock as its pendulum swung faster and faster, blurring into invisibility. "It's not time," he whispered. "It's choosing." "Choosing what?" she asked, trembling. "Who's next?" The second vanishing it chose James. It happened during dinner. They were all seated, silent, eyes down, when James simply stopped. He didn't slump, didn't fall. He just froze mid-bite, fork hovering at his lips. His eyes rolled white. His body went still as marble. Then the lights flickered, and when they steadied again, James's chair was empty. The plate was gone. The fork lay on the table, prongs bent backward like a peeled insect. Mimi lunged to where he'd been sitting, clutching at air. Donald Sr. sat perfectly still, as if bracing for impact. Mary dabbed her mouth with her napkin and said, very calmly, "Two is gone." The fracture of memory by morning. Half the siblings insisted James had never existed. They spoke with blank certainty, like reciting multiplication tables. His name no longer appeared on the parish directory, nor on his birth certificate, which now listed deceased at birth in pale gray letters, though Mimi swore she had signed that very document when he was 18. When she tried to show them the family portrait on the mantel, the space between Don Jr. and Richard was simply blank wall. Her fingers shook as she traced the empty space. "He was right there," she whispered. "He was right." Mary put a finger to her lips. "Shh," she said. "He's listening. The hunger of the house, Diu." Disappearances made the house hungrier. It stopped pretending to be a house at all. The hum beneath the floorboards rose to a steady pulse that shook dishes from the cabinets. The air grew humid and warm, carrying the smell of wet stone. Mold crept along the walls in patterns that resembled branching veins. At night, they could hear something vast shifting beneath them, like the slow turn of a sleeping whale. Donald Sr. took to pacing with a hammer, muttering about weak points. He tore down sections of drywall looking for hidden crawl spaces, but behind every wall was just more wall, slick and black and faintly warm to the touch. Mimi stopped cleaning. She sat at the kitchen table for hours, staring at her hands as if she was no longer sure they belonged to her. The counting Mary began counting the family out loud, like inventory. 0, she'd say, pointing at their father. 3 at Don Jr., 6, 7, 8, always skipping the missing numbers. When she got to herself, she smiled and said, "I am all of them." One night, Don Jr. whispered to Richard, "What happens when she gets to 12? Richard shuddered. "There aren't 12 of us," he said. Don Jr. stared at him. There had been. He was sure of it. But when he tried to name them all, his mind hit blank spaces, like missing teeth. The basement opens. The final crack came when the basement door, long rusted shut, swung open on its own. A cold draft rolled out that smelled like deep caves. Old stone, old water, and something sweet and wrong underneath. At the bottom of the stairs, they could see it waiting, the circle. Now 20 feet wide, rising and falling in the dark like the chest of something asleep. And at its center, 2 pairs of shoes, Brian's James's, waiting. The house that 8 names. By the time the final night came, only 5 of them remembered there had ever been more. The house was almost unrecognizable now. The air was thick as syrup, damp as lung tissue, and the walls curved subtly inward as though the entire structure had begun to inhale. The corridors no longer led where they used to. A hallway that once opened into bedrooms now ended in a blank wall of slick black stone, faintly warm, pulsing like a heartbeat beneath a thin skin. It didn't creak anymore. It breathed. Mimi had stopped eating. She sat in the living room like a relic, lips moving silently, eyes glazed. The rosary lay broken across her lap, beads scattered like seeds on the carpet. Donald Sr. prowled the perimeter with his hammer, muttering calculations under his breath, as though sheer geometry could banish whatever had colonized the house. His eyes were wide and red like he'd been awake for years. Mary just watched him from the stairs, smiling faintly. The decision. The voice returned at 3:17 a.m., sharp, clear, and close as breath in the ear. "The frame is complete. Bring them down." Mary rose. No hesitation, no ceremony. She simply turned and walked toward the basement door. It swung open before she touched it. the hinges sighing like something relieved. Don Jr. and Richard stared at each other. "If we follow her, we die," Richard said. "If we don't," Don Jr. replied, "we stop existing." The words felt like they weren't his own. Like the house had spoken through him. Mimi stood. Her eyes were empty as dried wells. "Go," she said. Then she sat back down, folded her hands, and closed her eyes. They went. The descent. The basement stairs were longer now. Each step sank slightly underfoot, soft and spongy, and the air grew warmer, wetter, like the inside of an animal. The walls wept condensation that gleamed in their flashlight beams like oil on black glass. The hum rose with every step until it wasn't sound anymore but pressure, pushing on their bones, on their teeth. Their noses bled in perfect unison, and then they reached the floor. The circle filled the entire space, etched deep into the concrete, except the concrete was gone, replaced by a slick, veined surface that rose and fell like a sleeping lung. At the center stood the shoes, Brian's, James's, and now another pair. They were empty, but warm. Mary stepped onto the circle. Her feet sank slightly, like stepping onto wet sand. She turned back to her brothers with eyes as black and depthless as the space between stars. "I told you," she said gently, "I am all of them." The truth. Then the floor opened. It didn't crack or break, and it peeled, unrolling like the skin of fruit, revealing a vast hollow beneath the house. The smell hit them like a wave. Stone, blood, ozone, and something older, like the inside of meteorites. And they saw them. All of them. Not dead. Not alive. The missing brothers stood in the pit below, their faces blurred like smeared paint, bodies swaying gently as if underwater. Their mouths were open in silent screams, and from their chests ran black filaments that snaked upward, embedding themselves in the walls, in the house, in everything. The house hadn't been haunted. It had been rooted. The brothers weren't gone. They were absorbed. The house had been feeding on their histories, stripping them from memory, from record, from reality itself, and knitting them into its own structure. Each vanished name made it stronger, thicker, more real than the people who had lived in it. Mary smiled. "This is what he was building," she whispered. "A house that keeps what the world forgets. A house that remembers when people stop." She turned to step down into the pit. Don Jr. lunged to grab her, and the circle pulsed once, hard. The collapse time fractured like ice. The walls convulsed. The floor bucked upward and split, hurling Richard into the pit. He didn't scream, just flickered once like a film frame catching fire and went out. Mary dissolved into black filaments mid-step, unspooling like threads pulled from the weave of the world. Don Jr. ran. He sprinted up the heaving stairs as the house collapsed inward, its rooms folding like pages, its halls erasing themselves as he passed through. Every photograph on the walls burst into black ash as he ran past. He crashed through the front door just as it sealed behind him like a closing eyelid. The night air hit him like a slap. When he turned back, the house was gone, not destroyed, gone. The lot was bare. No foundation, no debris. Just an empty stretch of grass slick with dew, humming faintly under the moonlight. The last name. The police didn't believe him. There were no property records for the address. No birth certificates for anyone named Galvin. No school files, no parish directories, nothing. His own driver's license bore a different surname he didn't recognize, and no photograph. There was no record of his siblings. No record of his parents. No record of him. Don Jr. stayed in motels under fake names, though every name felt fake now. He stopped using mirrors. They showed nothing. At night, he dreams of the house, and every dream ends the same way. He's standing on the basement floor, the circle beneath him and Mary's voice whispering from everywhere at once. 0 is hollow. 1 is gone. You were 3, but now you are none. And in the morning he wakes to find another part of himself missing, a scar he can't remember getting, a song he used to know, a name that used to belong to him. Until someday soon there will be nothing left, only the house. Waiting for the next name to remember.